everybody, and a very warm welcome to the Australian Institute of International Affairs here in New South Wales. Our subject tonight is the geostrategic competition in our immediate region, which is creating new challenges for Australia. In this presentation, Associate Professor Adam Lockyer from Macquarie University will be exploring how Australia can use its sea power more effectively to shape the international strategic environment. It seems almost certain that the subject of submarines will arise in the course of the evening, and I have to admit that I'm a bit of a submarine skeptic. One submarine by 2035, and with the interoperability which is being trumpeted so heavily by our incoming Defence Minister and many others, whose submarine will it actually be? Will we just have bought one for our combined forces with the United States? But look, I shouldn't be rabbiting on about that. We've got an expert here. Adam Lockyer is Associate Professor in Strategic Studies at Macquarie University. His previous experience includes work at the University of New South Wales, the United States Studies Centre at the University of Sydney, the Lowy Institute, and the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. We'll be following our usual format, so half an hour for questions both from the audience here at Glover Cottages and the equally substantial audience that we welcome tonight online. If you're asking questions online, please lodge them through the Q&A function on the Zoom screen before you. So it's over to you, Adam. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. It feels like just yesterday that I was here addressing you last time, and that was for the launch of my last book, Australia's Defence Strategy. And it was a wonderful night. We had a store down here where Glee Books was flogging the book off, and the room was full of engaged and interesting people. However, there was one big problem. When it came time for the question and answers and comments part of the night, the book was already published, and there was many good questions and comments, and it was too late. So at the time, I made the mental note that the next time that my research project was getting to fruition, I would come and address you before I went to press rather than after, so I can make sure I address your questions and comments before it is open on the bookshelves. So tonight, part of that effort is to talk a bit about my current research, but also to put it within some of the current geostrategic challenges that Australia is confronting. So this time last week, Speaker of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, was landing in Taiwan. She spent 20 hours there speaking to various members of the leadership team of Taiwan. Ever since then, we've seen substantial Chinese exercises around Taiwan. So the map on the screen here shows a comparison between the exercises that became known as the Third Taiwan Crisis in 95-96 and what is currently being undertaken by the PLA today. So the grey areas on the screen are from 95-96, the Third Taiwan Crisis, and what we see today. And we see that both China's intent and capabilities have increased dramatically since 95-96. So rather than simply going off primarily into the Taiwan Straits, that Chinese activity now is surrounding Taiwan, and we have missile tests, naval exercises, and air penetrations right around Taiwan. Now, some of Australia's leading strategic minds are commenting on this and saying, well, this might not all be bad. So in the top, we have Nick Ryan, who was a Major General up to recently, retired by being the Commandant of the Australian War College down in Canberra. And he writes that the coming days will permit us to observe how China and the PLA might think about conducting a naval blockade of Taiwan. In essence, they're telegraphing their operational approach so we can wargame ways to subvert it in the future. Professor John Blaxland writes something similar. He is a professor down at the SDSC at ANU, and he writes that Beijing's largest ever exercises around Taiwan have offered key clues into its plans for a grueling blockade in the event of a war to take the self-ruled island and reveal an emboldened Chinese military whose plans are worth studying. So both Mick Ryan and John Blaxland are arguing that China has shown its hand, that by conducting these exercises, what the West and Taiwan can take away is how they plan to mount a blockade of Taiwan in the future. And there might be there's some basis of this. So we have a look at what they're doing around Taiwan. Down in the southeast, we're looking at mostly a sea control type of strategy where naval units are trying to block the Bashid Canal. That's the main access point into the South China Sea and the route that the US carrier strike groups normally take when they're trying to get into the South China Sea. Further to the north, into the northwest of Taiwan, you see that the PLA are mostly using air interception and missile strikes rather than using surface vessels. To the east, somewhat surprisingly, that's where we're seeing most of their warships operating. So it would seem that what the warships there, aircraft carriers and major surface vessels are attempting to do in case of a blockade of Taiwan is to deter American reinforcements coming to Taiwan. So those assets there are pretending to attack the east of Taiwan, but also exercising sea control to try and block American reinforcement, American support. To the north, we're seeing mostly aircraft and missiles being used. So fewer warships and targets themselves. They're using mostly missile strikes to the north around Taipei. So coming back to these views that can we look at what's going on around Taiwan as an accurate depiction of how a PLA blockade of Taiwan would actually play out. And so there is some basis to what they're saying, but I think the point that these strategists are missing is that China knows this, right? China knows that we're watching. And so as much as this is a credible depiction of how a blockade of Taiwan would play out, it's also theatre, it's pantomime, it's communication, right? Signaling to the West about they're capable and they've got the intent to mount these blockades. So there's an element of strategic communication going on as well. So this brings us to the aspect of sea power that I would like to discuss with you tonight. So sea power can be used for a range of very functional purposes. It can be used to rescue stranded yachtsmen. It can be used for humanitarian aid and disaster relief. It can be used for warfighting. But it can also be used for communication. So when you send a warship on a FONUP, it is not about the capability that's being presented. It's the communication that's being used, right? So this is a form of naval diplomacy, of gunboat diplomacy. So we can use sea power to shape and influence the international environment. The two main mechanisms would be through deterrence and reassurance. Tonight, I'm going to focus primarily on the former, but we can also talk a bit more about reassurance as well. The way that you can conduct or use sea power to make Australia the South Pacific's security partner of choice, how we can reassure that our partners and allies that we will be there and we're a reliable partner if they ever get into a jam. So let's focus primarily on the first aspect, deterrence. So deterrence increases the expected costs and risks associated with a future action in the minds of an opposing decision maker. Now, in the literature, what you mostly find is this is a binary between attack and not attack. So if you're going to try to deter another actor, you build an army, and this army is supposed to stand there and deter another state from attacking you because you have this army and you can defend yourself. What I'd like to unpick, though, is that this binary between attack and not attack is not how foreign affairs is normally played out, right? You've got different contingencies. How would a different actor react in different circumstances? So it's about the intent, but also the capabilities to respond in different contingencies rather than necessarily all in or all out. Now, the flexibility of sea power allows states to respond in proportional ways, in different ways, to either retaliate or to deny, and to increase the costs or the risks in response to different contingencies in a way that often land power finds difficult. Land power, after a soldier is in combat, they're in combat for the rest of the conflict, whereas ships can sail into waters, out of waters, signal restraint or an offensive intention in different manners. So there's a few different ways that you can use sea power to deter. The traditional way that literature will talk about sea power being used to deter is through what they call command of the seas. So this harps back to the 9th century, when the objective of sea power was to gain command of the seas. So if we're thinking back into the 9th century and the way that naval power was being used between primarily the British and the French, but there were also other actors there, that the fleet would sail out, you would engage in a pitched conflict, battle with the opponent, you would then sink the opposition fleet, then you would have command of the seas. That means that your commercial shipping is safe from being intercepted by the opponent's warships because they've all been sunk, and you would then be free to mount blockades, amphibious assaults, bombardments, what have you, and apply pressure on the other. After you have command of the seas, then everything else should follow, where others would be unwilling to attack you because you rule the seas. In the late 19th century, there was a few challenges to this idea of command of the seas, and perhaps there was other ways to deter actors through having not necessarily command of the seas, but challenging their command of the seas. So Admiral Tirpitz of the Imperial German Navy came up with risk theory. Now, risk theory argues that you don't need to have naval supremacy in order to deter. All you need to do is be able to hurt the opponent sufficiently enough that their rule of the sea will be under question. So at the time in 1897, when Tirpitz was writing, the German Navy only had 12 battleships, which was not nearly enough to deter Britain, which had 62 battleships. But what Tirpitz argued was that we didn't need to have parity with the British. All we need to do is to be able to hurt them enough and sink enough of their battleships that their 62 battleships would be under pressure from France's 36 battleships. So as long as we can hurt them enough to drag them back down, then their command of the seas would be threatened and they would be less likely to attack us because we can hurt them sufficiently. This idea of command of the seas had currency right up to the 1970s, when sea control began to be the dominant idea. So rather than having one ruling naval power that was going to rule supreme over the world's seas, more likely, in most cases, most of the time, the best that a nation can hope for is to control part of the sea for a fixed amount of time. So in the 1970s, we saw that the Soviet fleet was on the rise. The Soviets had put a lot of effort into their navy after the humiliation of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that was starting to come to fruition in the 1970s. the Americans no longer had ultimate command of the seas, so they needed this new concept. So what they came up with was sea control. So here we could think about part of the sea being under the US Navy's complete control for a fixed amount of time. And here we could use that for a number of different purposes. We can use that offensively or defensively. So, the offensive version, what the Americans would hope to do is to control a part of the sea in a foreign power's coastal seas, and then use that to launch airstrikes, bombardment, amphibious assaults, missile strikes, and bombardment. And this has been how the US Navy has conducted itself at least since the 1970s. Then we have defensive sea control. Here, rather than being able to project power towards an enemy coast and be able to then put political pressure on the opposition state, what we can also do is control the seas close to your coast and block enemy forces from coming close to your shores. And this is more or less what Paul Dibb had in mind when he wrote the Dibb Report in 86 and then became formalised in the 87 Defence White Paper. So we'll defend Australia by controlling the seas around Australia through land defence. So an opponent wouldn't be able to project force towards Australia's coastline. Before they got here, they would either be shot down or sunk by the Australian Defence Force. So Australia's defence policy has been broadly based upon defensive sea control since the 1980s, with some loosening up in the 2000s after September 11. We have other options here too. The other option is, rather than trying to dominate the seas either in an offensive fashion like the US Navy tries to do, or a defensive a way that we try to do in the 1980s, we can also just try and make it really risky for the opponents to operate in the seas. So this is called sea denial. So rather than necessarily trying to seize sea control yourself and dominate the seas and use the sea the way that you want to be able to use it, all you need to do is just to sabotage the opposition's ability to control the seas, either in an offensive fashion or a defensive fashion. So offensive, you can use submarines to menace the opponent's sea lanes communication, so the commercial shipping. You can mine the harbours. You can do other things that is just going to cause mischief for the opponent and inflict costs and risks on the opponent in their own seas. Defensive sea denial works the same way. We can use sea mines, we can use submarines and other assets to simply make it an unsafe environment for the opponent to operate in. So in Australia's case, we could purchase a large number of short-range conventional submarines, spread them out across the north of Australia. They won't be able to have sea control themselves. They won't be able to dominate the sea, but an opponent would be unlikely to project their own or send their own high-valued ships, troop transports, carriers, logistical ships into those seas if they're swarming with Australian submarines. And that's more or less what Hugh White argues, right? That all we need is a large number of short-range conventional submarines, some airstrike, maritime strike capabilities across the north of Australia, make it really unsafe for a superior opponent to operate through those waters, and they would be deterred from sending those forces into the area. We don't need to dominate the north the way that Paul Dibb argued in the 1980s. All we need to do is make it really unsafe for them. Now, what I'll move on to now is that we've set this up as these four major different strategies, right? Offensive, defensive, sea control, or sea denial, but they're not either or. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union used a naval strategy that involved both sea denial and sea control. So further out from the Soviet Union, they would use sea denial. So they'd use long-range maritime strike. They'd use long-range submarines to make it an unsafe environment for the American and NATO Navy to operate in. closer to their coastline, they would use surface vessels, more submarines, and land-based strike to dominate the seas so that the US Navy couldn't get close to the Soviet Union in both the European theatre, but also in the Pacific theatre. If that looks familiar, that's basically what the Chinese are doing for A2AD. So any access area denial is further out. They're using missiles and submarines closer to home. They're trying to deter the American Navy from projecting force close to China's shores through surface vessels, more land-based air power, and what have you. Okay, so how do you communicate all of this to your opponent? So we've got these 4 different naval strategies, right? And now we need to decide, well, how are we going to communicate this to our opponent that we've got the intent and the capabilities to carry this out? And here we can reach back to Robert Jervis, very sadly passed away last year. And one of his earlier works, this was his PhD that got turned into his first book, The Logic of Images in International Relations. And he talks about indexes and signals. And indexes are things that you invest substantial effort into that the opponent will not believe could be a cheap signal. It's not just cheap communication. It costs too much. There's too much investment in it. So it's got to be reliable. It's got to be believable. And I would argue that when we were looking back at Mick Ryan and John Blackman, and they was looking at those naval exercises around Taiwan, they were understanding those as indices, right? So they're an index of what the Chinese intend to do because they're too big, they're too large, they're too expensive to be a fake signal. Move that one. So bring this a bit close to home. So how can Australia use naval exercises to communicate our naval strategy? Well, the first point that we need to think about is we use naval exercises all the time as strategic communication. Whenever we conduct a large naval exercise, this is a form of communication. We know that there's an audience that's watching our naval exercises to get a sense of how we will respond in different contingencies. And if we have a look at our large recurring exercises, we get a bit of a sense of the different aspects of how Australia intends to respond in these different contingencies. So the first one is an annual exercise that's conducted each year called Ocean Explorer. It's moved around the coast of Australia so that the Navy is able to get experience in operating in different environments. It's large and it's mostly about sea control. So if you're watching Ocean Explorer every year, what you'll find is, or the message that you're receiving is that Australia's dominant strategic or maritime posture is one of defensive sea control, that you will not, if you're an opponent, you will not be able to project naval power towards Australia's shores because our Navy will be able to prevent you from moving in through our maritime approaches. So if you're watching Ocean Explorer, that's probably the message you're going to receive. But we've also got Talisman Sabre. Now, Talisman Sabre sends a very different signal because it's done primarily in Queensland and its focus is on amphibious assault. So it's a multinational exercise primarily between Australia and the United States, and it uses our new LHDs as its central platform for conducting amphibious assaults in Queensland. So here you would have moved away. You'd say, well, rather than being defensive sea control, Australia's naval strategy is one of offensive sea control, where we're looking to mount amphibious assaults on the opponent. So if you attack us, we're going to send an LHD and launch an amphibious assault of your country. Then we've got RIMPAC, which is just finished up last week. large multinational exercise conducted off Hawaii with the United States at its core. And here we have a different signal altogether, where rather than being one of Australia operating alone, or more or less alone in amphibious operations, here we've got a large multinational force using offensive sea control as well. So the question here is, well, what signal is Australia sending through its series of exercises? What is our intent? What is our capability to opponents? So what does all this mean? So Australia's case is really interesting for conventional maritime deterrence, because what it highlights is that one country can have multiple deterrence postures. So normally in the literature, what you see is you've got the United States and you've got the Soviet Union, and they're trying to deter each other. It's this dyad of states. Whereas in Australia's case, what you're seeing at the operational level is that we're preparing for a bunch of different contingencies. So in one case, we're operating in a defensive sea control posture, which is trying to deter another sort of regional power from projecting power towards Australia. Talon Sabre, if you're watching that in Beijing, you wouldn't be frightened by that at all. That's not intended for you, right? What Talon Sabre is intended for, it's basically refighting East Timor this time really well, right? So if you're in the South Pacific and you're thinking about undertaking actions that Australia might retaliate towards, you'd be looking at Talon Sabre. You wouldn't be looking at RIMPAC. You wouldn't be looking at Ocean Explorer. You'd be looking at this exercise as an indication of how Australia intends to respond if you were to undertake malign actions towards Australia. Then you've got RIMPAC, which is more directed towards China. Right? So if things do escalate again in Taiwan, the exercises that we're training for in RIMPAC is the type of response that China can expect from the regional navies. So what we're seeing in Australia's case is we've got this balanced fleet of a range of capabilities, but we're also targeting different, practicing different contingencies, which different actors will be watching, and they know if that's actually meant for them or it's meant for somebody else. And finally, it also highlights the role of strategic communication in exercises. So although we have these different exercises that we participate in each year, and they're exercising different activities and different responses to different contingencies, it's not necessarily done in a strategic way, right? So the naval planners of these exercises know that they might be called upon to undertake these activities, and so they're preparing for them, right? The strategic communication part of it is either further down their list of priorities, if it's there at all. So we can sharpen up the communication element of our exercises and turn them into sharper points of communication that each of these different audiences, if they're in the South Pacific, if they're a regional power, or if they're a great power, that this exercise is meant for you. And if you were to threaten our interests, this is how you can expect Australia to respond. And through sharpening up the messages of these exercises, you're going to be more effective at shaping and influencing the region. Thank you.
Terrific, Adam. Thank you very much. We now have half an hour for questions and answers. If you're here in the hall, please wait for the microphone to reach you. But shall we start with a question from our online audience? Okay, who'd like to ask something from here in the hall? Dr. J, please wait for the microphone.
Thank you very much. You remind me that there was a lot of publicity about Chinese naval ships off the Australian coast, as if they were there with malicious intent, but I'm pretty sure they were just following naval exercises. And so perhaps from what your concluding remarks, that might be built into the future naval exercises, that there might be, like a message that went out and said, if you like to be in such and such a position, next month you might see something of interest or something. I'm not quite sure how it would be phrased. But the flip side is really what I wanted to ask you about. That is Chinese naval exercises. And if you know how and to what extent Australia is monitoring them, I think it's more from the Air Force rather than the Navy. For instance, there were large-scale exercises in the northern part of the South China Sea recently, south of Hainan, and we know that there were Australian Air Force planes flying over there. In fact, they were sort of buzzed by Chinese Air Force. So perhaps we might also communicate to the Chinese that it might be to their advantage. If we were in a certain place at a certain time, we might see something interesting. I'd be interested in your comments about this, the role of this communication associated with exercises. Thank you.
That's a brilliant question. And so this happens, it's routine. So whenever the Chinese undertake an exercise, you can be sure that the regional states are watching. So Japan and the United States in particular, but also Australia. So we have, before those exercises, we had two P-8A maritime surveillance aircraft, and they were flying up through the South China Sea. And that's when one of them was challenged by a Chinese fighter and started to launch flares and cut across the front, launch chaff, which is like this aluminium stuff that got stuck in its engines. So it's routine. So the moment that the Chinese put up an exclusion zone saying we're going to have a live fire exercise in this area, you can be sure that American surveillance aircraft are in the air, flying there right then to watch what's going on, to collect as much intelligence as possible. We make very few secrets about our exercises, and so the Chinese will send AGI, like a surveillance ship, down to watch Taliban Sabre, Ocean Explorer. They've got a front row seat to all of this stuff. And so both sides are watching each other's exercises really intently. And this is kind of my point, that if you want to understand what your opponent will likely do in different circumstances, if you read the official published public strategy documents, it's very broad and very general. So we would like to uphold stability and peace and stability in the Pacific region, right? We'll do this by working collaboratively with our security partners and neighbours, right? That doesn't tell you anything. What tells you something is going to their exercises and getting front row seat. And you can watch their amphibious exercise, you can watch their missile test, you can watch what's going on in Taiwan, and you can then get a sense of how they're likely to respond. And everybody is watching everybody else. And this is not new. So there was some research that was done on land exercises and during the Cold War. And the historian that was undertaking the research on NATO land exercises, Reforger and other these big exercises where the Americans were sending forces across to Europe, the best and most detailed archival resource that they found wasn't in NATO, but it was in the former Warsaw Pact, right? Because they were watching these so intently, and there was like streams of data on every element of what was going on. So in a way, the opposition actually knows your exercises better than you do. right? And so this is why, in terms of communication, as a form of communication, they're so valuable. But there's also, and one of my points here, it's also an underdeveloped part of how planners go about it, because if there was a naval officer here and you ask them about an exercise, they'll say exercises are really important. They're important for training crews, for testing doctrine, for tactics, for intergenerational knowledge. So young sailors learn from old sailors. They're really valuable. If you ask the sailor, sort of, well, what about the communication part? Oh, yeah, there's that too. We know that they're watching us, but we don't actually construct our exercises necessarily with that in mind, right? But if you enhance that, then you're going to improve the communication element of your exercises, and that's how you can shape and influence your opponent's mind and their future behaviour.
2 questions, Dr. Bronski.
Thank you, Alan. Did you mean me or her?
Thank you, Ian. Actually, my question does follow on from Jocelyn's, if you don't mind. Thank you, Alan, for that. Given what you've said about this quite prudent communication between us and other nations who are involved, why is it so difficult for Australian citizens and groups in Australia to get information for our own government about these activities? My organisation, Australians for War Powers Reform, has asked repeatedly for details about Talisman Sabre, etc. And you either get no answer, or you get a brush off, or you're told it's national security, so you're not allowed to be told. Why?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's a very good question. And the Navy in particular is probably keeps too much of this stuff confidential. That we know that the Chinese have better access to a lot of the exercise material than what we do. And there's a lot of stuff is kept secret when there's no real need for it to be kept secret. I think in part things are changing slowly. So now Indo-Pacific Endeavour is another exercise they undertake mostly in the South Pacific and then off into the Southeast Asia. And they're starting to embed academics and journalists and stuff on the exercise itself. They've had a few bad experiences with that, however, with journalists and academics writing about the progress of the LHDs or whatever ship they're embedded on. And what tends to get traction is any interaction with the Chinese, right? So in one case, back in 2017, the Indo-Pacific Endeavour was sailing into Fiji, and down in Fiji, the Chinese have a communication ship that's pretty much permanently down in the South Pacific because they need it for the satellites. But it sails in and out of Fiji just to resupply with food and petrol, and it sails back out again. But when the Australian fleet showed up, it was broadcasters here as the Chinese are spying on us. They parked their ship right next to our ship. And it kind of all got blown out of proportion. And so the Navy does try to open up occasionally, but they often get their fingers burnt by this type of thing, and then they close back down again, and they make these baby steps towards opening up again, and they close back down, and we sort of have this type of dynamic. But I think broadly speaking, you do see a trend towards more openness at sea, because they know they've got to get ahead of the narrative. When there is an incident at sea between Australian ships and Chinese ships, or an Australian P-8A and a Chinese fighter jet, you've got to get ahead of the narrative, right? So you need your journalists and your academics to sort of be tweeting and saying this is going on. The Australians had right away, and it was the Chinese that were acting dangerously or what have you. So they kind of see the value in it, but they are also a bit cautious as well.
Chris, and then Richard.
Chris Skinner, I served 30 years in the Navy in 6 warships. I agree wholeheartedly with your point about communicating exercises. I've got 2 points, though, that I think are missing from your presentation, unless it was while I was out, which I apologise for. Merchant shipping and, to a lesser extent, civil aviation are very dense around Taiwan, and the effect of those Chinese designated areas was very profound economically, commercially, and so on. And the Chinese know that, and they are very good at exploiting power in its full sense. Power is not just military power, it's economic power, it's demographic power, and so on. My other point is that I think you need to go beyond exercises and look at some real world experience. The Falklands War 40 years ago, the UK lost 6 ships, and they were only faced by a very courageous Argentinian Air Force with iron bombs mainly and a few Exocet missiles. And more recently in the Ukraine, the Russian Navy has lost 6 ships from shore-launched missiles. That didn't seem to figure in what you're doing, and it may be because the Australian Defence Force is not exercising what they should be. Your point about swarming is very well taken. But getting to a question, how should Australia progress into the future without its over-reliance on the US?
So your first point is completely right. The exercises being undertaken by the PLA around Taiwan is not just theatre. There are sort of costs involved for the Taiwanese and for the region in terms of shipping and airlines and what have you. Very true. Second is, yes, wars are probably the best demonstration of your military capability, right? And the 1991 Gulf War had a huge impact on the psyche of both China and Russia, on American military technology, and just how far ahead they were when we saw. We all remember General Schwarzkopf there, and he's pointing to the map, and you're watching sort of cruise missiles going through windows for the first time, right? This is sort of earth-shattering for many, but we can't rely on a good war as a demonstration, right? We need to, in terms of a demonstration, the second best to a war is an exercise, and in that case, realism matters. Right, because you can judge how effective a naval force is if you're watching, if you're the audience, by how realistic it is. You got the blue side, your team, you've got the red team, and then how is the fake enemy allowed to win? Right, or how realistic are the conditions that the exercises are being undertaken in? The more realistic the exercise, the more information you gain from watching the exercise, but also the more information that the exerciser gets as well. So we're trying to, so I take your point that a real operation is probably the gold standard, but if you're mounting an exercise, you're trying to get as close to the real thing as possible. The closer you get, the more information everyone gets, right? The audience, but also the exerciser themselves. And finally, the question on moving ahead without the US. A good question, really good question. And I really don't know. So, yeah, I mean, I do think that, broadly speaking, that the Trump presidency shook many. That had just come to think that you can rely upon the United States in all cases, in all circumstances. And, American domestic politics is in such a way now where that is beginning, I think, to impact a way that many strategists think about America in the past. And in a way that if you went back 5-10 years ago, you just wouldn't have the idea that you couldn't rely upon the United States in all circumstances or in the future. Just probably wasn't at the point of where it is now. But how you attempt to, whether or not you want to, I guess that's a question now for Stephen Smith and Angus. So yeah, we'll see.
Richard and then Bob.
Thanks. Adam, thank you for a very interesting talk. We had no submarines, no operational submarines in the Second World War. If we had a small flotilla of submarines up in the Torres Strait on the 19th of February 1942, perhaps the 4 aircraft carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor and were now about to attack Darwin might have had second thoughts. And also the submarines that attacked Sydney and Newcastle in June of that year may have been warned off if we'd had area denial. The elephant in the room here, and you've partly answered your position as a theoretical academic involved in military affairs, is a very wise one. If I was in your position, I'd have a lot of doubts about giving some definitive opinion that I had. But the elephant in the room is that we have, particularly the Murdoch press, but other press elements and other academics and commentators panicking at the fact that we have no submarines and that there's a gap of many years before we get nuclear propelled submarines. I think what's going to happen, my own personal view, is that Miles will say, all right, and the government will say, let's get conventional submarines with air-independent propulsion, like the Soyuz, like many of the submarines that are being built in Europe, and have those instead. My question to you, though, if you're prepared to give any sort of opinion about it, is do you see that if we got nuclear-propelled submarines from the United States, we would be beholden to the US in its command and control and in the tactics it wanted to use for those submarines, and that we would have no independent command of those submarines?
I would probably, great question. I probably want to go as far as saying no independent command, but you would be, you would be integrated more heavily into their operational planning, and they would expect you to be so, right? Which is part of the problem. So if you have more capability, then the United States knows you have these capabilities, and then they'll be expecting you to carry them out. So if you have SSNs that can steam off at a rapid rate of knots into the South China Sea up to Taiwan, and if things do escalate, hypothetically, then the Americans will expect you to do so. Whereas if you've got a Collins class that's going to take a month to get there and have to sort of stop off at Singapore on the way through to refuel and all the rest of it, then sometimes there is benefit in not having the capability. If you sort of just deny yourself the capability, then others can't expect you to or ask you to use it. So I guess in terms of the command and control, but I don't think that would mean that we would lose autonomy of our use of the submarines. If anything, they'll become even a large, more strategic capability where the national security of cabinet would want even tighter control over the asset. But at the same time, when the US gives them a phone call and say, we want you to do this, they can't just say, well, we can't, right? Because they know you can. And so whether or not you can then easily say no when you don't want to do certain things.
Thanks very much, Adam. That was a great presentation. Could I perhaps look at it from a different angle. I can imagine a lot of people listening to this would have been quite frightened by what you had to say. Frightened because it was a discussion about capabilities for making war. And it seems to suggest that the more of this, the more likely there is to be war, and therefore it's all very frightening. On the other hand, people might also argue that strategic communication is an order-making mechanism, whether it's overt and deliberately intended or not. It is still the case that the more we know about each other's capabilities is a good thing. People who say that are reminded of the fact that in the past, states have miscalculated and wars have resulted from miscalculation. It seems to me that because of the communications revolution, there is now less possibility or likelihood of miscalculation. And the communications revolution has delivered that, just as it's delivered a way out in arms control, particularly at the nuclear level. So am I right in thinking that even though you say in one of your slides that strategic communication was an afterthought, there is in fact more strategic communication going on, and that in fact it's a good thing?
No, I think you're right. So things are much easier to observe now than they were, say, during the Cold War. So during the Cold War, the major way that you would, so there's two parts to this. The first one is that sea power has always been easier to observe than land power or nuclear weapons or air power. The reason for this is that most exercises are undertaken in international waters. And so even during the Cold War, when the Soviets had a large exercise, you would have a shadowing operation that would be triggered. And the larger the Soviet exercise, the larger the shadowing operation in response. So they were always trying to observe each other. And you get a lot more information at sea than you would at land, because the two ships can sail in close vicinity for a long time and you can just watch each other. Whereas on land, you either have to have a visiting officer, so you can invite foreign officers to come watch your exercises, where you don't never really believe what you're watching, or a satellite. And during the Cold War, it was mostly photography and get a snapshot of what's going on. Whereas these days, you're right, like satellite technology, UAVs, electronic surveillance is all gone. It's just has revolutionized how much information you can gain from watching each other's exercises. And that is just vacuumed up, spat out as a net assessment of their capabilities, but also their tactics. And it's ran through simulators, and they run through computers to see, well, who would actually win, right? And if you run these exercises, your exercises and their exercises through computers, and you continually find that you lose, then you're not going to cause trouble, right? Because you suspect what the outcome's going to be. So the more information you have, the more accurate that pitch is going to be. The dangerous part would be that if you think you can win, right? And if the Chinese are watching the American exercises and vice versa, and the Chinese get to a point where they say, we might have a chance here, that's where difficulty could happen.
Sure.
Thank you. I'm aware of the competitive nature of the two hegemons, if you like, in the world. And obviously, it's very much more advanced technologically in the USA, but the Chinese seem to certainly be catching up. And obviously, alliances are very significant in all of that. But what I wonder about, and in your talk, is the move towards the use of satellites and artificial intelligence, and how that's affecting basically strategic. You're talking about shadowing of people, but at the same time, there are developments that even can be launched from space now, as well as the monitoring. And of course, when you talk about training, there's artificial intelligence, and we've already seen that usage in places like Iraq. So how does that link into what you're talking about?
Yeah, a really great question. So exercises with new technology is interesting because you've got different competing interests here. In terms of the strategic communication stuff, you don't want to demonstrate new technology until you're confident it's going to work, right? Because if you mount lasers on your warships and you then sail them out and the Chinese are watching and they're a complete bust, then that's going to undermine your posture, but also your deterrence, right? Because they know these capabilities are going to work. So you kind of want to keep this secret, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's new drones, lasers, space technology, until it's developed to a point and you're confident it's going to work when you demonstrate it to an opponent. But the other side of this stuff is that you need practice, and you need to take it to see whether it works or not, test it. So you've got these frictions here, and I guess if we had a sailor there, they would be saying, right, let's take to sea. I want to test this stuff. I want to be able to then go away and write doctrine and tactics around new technology, whether it's artificial intelligence, space-based capabilities, what have you. Whereas myself as a political scientist would say, what signal, what's the strategic communication? What can we take away from the audience if this is a big film, right? And so there's always this friction between, I guess, deterrence on the one hand, and what's necessary for defence on the other. And I guess that's just this friction that we need to sort of try and balance. All I would argue is that at this stage, as far as Australian planning around exercises go, it's very heavily leaning towards defence and those very functional benefits of exercising. And there's an underdeveloped element of this as well, which is that communication part of it.
Well, thank you very much to our audience thank you very much for a very interesting range of questions. Next week, we've got a talk on the roots of the Sri Lankan crisis and its implications for Australia. And that's going to be given by Dr. Neera Kandasamy, a lecturer in history in the School of Humanities at the University of Sydney. So do come along for that one. But to finish off our event this evening, Ralph Houseco will move a vote thanks.
Well, I'd just like to thank Adam for his wonderful presentation. I think as a university student, we're constantly bombarded with all this information on China, exercises around Taiwan. And I think, a discussion laying out the core principles behind what is actually happening strategically is, a fantastic way to really get an insight into it. And I think, we've been very lucky to hear these thoughts today. And so I'd like to propose a formal vote of thanks by way of applause.